Yep. So again, my name is Garrona. Greetings from the high desert. I am broadcasting from Ogapoge, which is the White Shell Water Place in Santa Fe, New Mexico. What's on the image that you see is from Coronado Monument, just north of Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is where I was born and raised. I have strong ties to my communities of Jemez Pueblo and Church Rock, Churchill area of the Diné Nation. So it's my honor to be a part of this lecture series. Thank you, Heidi, and the team for asking Porter and I to take part. I wanted to kind of quickly speak through some of what I've experienced as a designer and architectural associate in the field and how it's informed some of our work. We work for an office here in Santa Fe, Atkin Olson Shade Architects. We have offices in Philadelphia, as well as Santa Fe, two of some of the oldest towns in America. And I'd like to kind of dig into that a little bit more. But today we're talking about mixing mud. So I wanted to kind of quickly get into the definition of Adobe, which is an Arabic word, which may have roots in the Egyptian language. And it describes a mixture of sand and clay in proper proportions so that a proper hardness or optimum hardness can be achieved. The organic material is of the earth and it begins to disintegrate as soon as it is formed. Much like us humans, we disintegrate as soon as we're formed. And not to say that all building materials don't disintegrate as soon as they're formed, but it is something that is a unique building material to this region in terms of the American architectural understanding, but not unique to this part of the globe. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of ordering devices and dwellings, some historic structures here in the Southwest, and tie some of these concepts into some case studies or work that my office is engaged in. So I have a lot to go through. Hopefully we can get through most of it. So I wanted to quickly take a look at some of these diagrams that I was able to find from a book called Dwellings, the Vernacular House Worldwide. It was written by Paul Oliver in 2007, and a lot of these sketches are coming from his personal sketchbook, traveling to these indigenous communities. What we see on the screen is the African Dogon village. It's in Mali, which is in West Africa, and it includes symbolic parallels to the human body. You can see entryways and courtyards and kind of pathways diagrammed out. Another instance of that book is a plan from Kibali. It's a Berber house, and also in Algeria, Africa, in Matka. And they use, I'd like to call attention to some of the use of the directional understandings of north, south, east, west, male and female, and kind of how they organize their space. Another plan here is of a Sakalva house in Madagascar, and they use astrological signs in their ordering system. The dates and sequences are kind of understood around the walls and corners of this space. The Parosha, or primal being, is an icon that's overlaid on 81 squares within a 9-square frame. And you can kind of see as a toggle between the two how the space is organized in that way. It's a principal designation of the spaces of a Balinese house. The plan of Harang or Balinese house yard with units placed in accordance with values associated with the 9-square Parosha. Some may be familiar with feng shui. It loosely translates to wind and water and how the movement of qi is affected by these elements. And the placement of these elements influence the movement of the qi and wind and water. Another plan from the Oliver's book, Tukanoan Maloka, or community house in Vupes region of Colombia. You can see in the plan how the organization works again with genders and directional understandings. But in the diagram on the right, you start to see more of a kind of a concentric understanding of how this community house sits within the cosmos of the sun path. And if you look closely, you'll see tree skin, bird skin, rain cloud skin, mist skin, moon's path, and these other kind of not often thought about ideas when it comes to architecture and construction. Another example, a lot of folks in my region may look at this and see a Hogan, but actually it's a yurt. Nomadic groups in Central Asia, present-day Russia, kind of organize their system as such, and they're often adorned with symbols to offer protection around the perimeter. And here's in Hogan, the Diné kind of understanding of space and a path which is similar to the sun's directional path. For this, I think there's an interesting note on how outdoor and indoor spaces are a part of this construction. So I kind of show these to say, you can't really understand a culture or what it's like to be in these spaces from a plan diagram. That's all we have today in this remote process, I guess, of conveying ideas is two-dimensional and some talking. But I like to show this image just to kind of show that in the Hogan, when we add time as a continuum, it also, along with the senses, really starts to alter your perception of the space. It's also very beautiful. So from that, I'll kind of jump off into some of the regional dwellings that we know here in the Southwest. The Hogan types in construction, there's not just one type. And there's male and female, different substructure, and also, again, it's important to understand how the outside is a big part of the construction. Similar to the Pima and Papago dwellings, these ones are actually inset within the earth, and later forms took on a rectilinear shape, but they often had that Jacqual kind of construction, and are deeply associated with shade structures as well that augment these spaces. And so these are kind of Southwest responses to the climate. And what I'm going to be mostly talking about today is Pueblo and architecture. A lot of times the understanding comes from a pit house evolution to what we see in present day communities. And I think one thing to note is that once you start to get 7 feet below the Earth's surface, you start to experience a constant where the temperature remains relative to the average temperature in that region. It works as a really great way to kind of stave off the extremes here in the desert. My first image showed snow. We do get snow. It does get really cold here. It's actually cold today, but we also get extremes of heat. So that really helps. And then you can see how that form kind of generates a cellular form with the pueblos. So prior to a lot of the well-known built works are the ancient Hohokam and Mogollon, and of course the ancestral Puebloan or Anasazi. These Mogollon pit houses, as you see, considered, I guess they occupied more the central Arizona and parts of New Mexico. And like the Hohokam, they use available materials to provide structure. They're often, trying to stave off the heat in those regions. But then how do we go from a pit house to something like this? So the Chaco construction by the ancestral Puebloan cultures began in the 800 Common Era and lasted more than 300 years. There are 150 great houses built throughout the region of this Chacoan Center, and they exhibit activities like commerce, trading, and ceremony. There's about 5,000 estimated population during the gatherings of this great house. It took 200,000 roof beams from over 40 up to 70 miles away to create the lumber for this construction. And it's contemporary with the Palenque, a Mayan city in southern Mexico. If you're familiar, some artist renderings. So the Chacoan sites, between 1050 and 1500 is what I'm showing on the screen here. There are more than 400 miles of roads up to 30 feet wide, engineered, planned, maintained. In some segments, actually lack a quote destination. So it's kind of an interesting mystery, I guess, for a lot of archaeologists. But they have internal trading routes shown here, and then also trading with Mexico or Toltecs, and evidenced by turquoise beads, necklaces, pendants, seashells. We're pretty far from the nearest ocean. Copper bells, macaw, and parrots, feathers, and actual living macaw animals were discovered in this region, which is pretty remarkable considering it's not the most favorable climate for them. More recent discoveries have found cocoa in their mugs. So, if anyone's drinking cocoa out there, you have something in common. Another kind of well-known technology that was apparent in the Chacoan culture is Fajada Butte had 3 stones, which is kind of a little mesa near this center space. And they tracked the movement of the sun with these 3 stones. So what you're seeing are during the kind of solstice, summer solstice, winter solstice, and equinoxes, specific light was cast on the spiral. But on that very same spiral, there were also lunar major and minor standstills, which are on an 18.6 year cycle. The last major standstill was in 2006. So the next one won't occur until April of 2025. And if you're interested, the minor will be in March 2034. It's just pretty remarkable to understand an 18.6 year cycle to that degree. And so that kind of understanding was also included in a lot of the architecture. Here showing one of the large great kivas, Costa Ricanada, with the light path illuminating an altar on summer solstice. And along those lines, there are large works that do have these alignments. So what we're seeing are connections with, or associations with cardinal directions, equinox, solstice, lunar major and minor observances, in the key here on the bottom associated with the actual location of these built works. And just recently I was in a lecture where some of the current archaeologists have found observances that mark the solar observances with the Bears Ears National Monument. So there are connections outside of this region and built works that do pay homage to the sun. But these are kind of like the big headlines, but also what's remarkable to me is the understanding and the engineering that allowed these constructions to be built and stay standing, right? So the understanding of the foundations, T-shaped doors, and having the load kind of distributed. We're talking stone here, in some cases 4 feet deep to be able to support 3 to 4 stories. So then there's kind of this, I like to kind of bring this back in terms of a diagram and how the community was able to, use like how we saw those earlier diagrams, how the sun and natural occurrences shaped these constructions. Another kind of Pueblo and ancestral Puebloan site that is well known is the Cliff Palace, which is one of 600 cliff dwellings. But what's not really known is that there are actually 4,000 sites in this region. The cliff dwellings get all of the headlines, right? But there is some remarkable engineering that happens on the mesa top. But back to Cliff Palace, there are some natural resources that, of course, a lot of folks are familiar with the passive solar of the overhang. But also what we see here is the ability to resource water through this sandstone. Kind of absorbs water like a sponge, and once it hits the shale layer, water can be available at different heights on this large rock formation. And then another kind of concept is the interstitial spaces, or the spaces in between the built works and how they kind of work with the rock structure. Here's some images of close up. It's kind of like a downtown scene here on the left, if you can imagine how these spaces were, dare I say, mixed use at a time when, these concepts were not, not defined the way that we define them today. But another kind of interesting lineage is the use of a kiva, and so I'd like to kind of get a little bit further into that. So one of the giants in my world is Rina Swensel. She's Towa and actually a family member of my co-presenter today. And she had this really great, elegant way of conveying kind of these Puebloan concepts into everyday English. And so I'll do my best to kind of relate her information, but she states we are, people of the earth, literally and figuratively. And so what you're seeing here are some diagrams of a bowl in its various scale forms. The sphere is the earth bowl. I'm sorry, the sphere is the earth bowl and the sky basket. So what you're seeing here are like the cardinal directions and how your the landscape kind of informs you, and on another scale how within a Puebloan or a Kiva type of setup, it kind of recreates the same scale and the same horizon line. And then also when you start to get into a Kiva, that same kind of understanding is available to you. So you're always able to be a part of these larger pieces, right? Like these things are always informing you. And the Bupinge is the center heart place, which is shown in many plazas that actually centers this concept. So each community would have this kind of centering place. And it's, it's important for all living things, and buildings become living by that very nature in the way that mountains are living. And there's this really strong sense of dualities of, above ground, below ground, you really get an understanding of the Mother Earth and Father Sky. And these dualities, continue to inform your centering and your place within this cosmos or this world. And so you have male and female, hot and cold, sun and moon, and so on and so forth that create this wholeness. So I'm very, very much a student in this world and continue to read her writings. And some of the diagrams are very beautiful and eloquent ways to kind of capture these concepts. And what we see here are how a center place, interacts with all of these surrounding entities, including clouds and mountains and animals and plants, as well as the ancestors who are in the soil right below. And it really makes way for a respect and a mindfulness about how you are engaged in this world. We're not only in the presence of our surroundings, but we are directly connected to them at all times. And so I wanted to go into a little bit more of the history of this region. So what you're seeing are the locations of the major mission pueblos of the 17th century, and I'll do a quick timeline. 1540, the first Spanish expedition into the Southwest. 1596, colonies begin to be established. 1610, Santa Fe is established. Because of the availability of good clay and soil, brick and other kind of industries are not really pursued here. So if it's not broke, you don't have to fix it. The mud, plaster, adobe approach to architecture in this region kind of remains much longer. That's kind of also works with the Spain's attempt to really put a stranglehold on only goods being purchased from Mexico and prohibit trading amongst the natives of the region, which is kind of an interesting approach, but it made way for folks to be able to continue the adobe tradition for much longer. So then in 1812, Anglo-American trade starts to increase with the Santa Fe Trail. 1848, the region's officially annexed as United States territory as a repercussion of the Mexican War, Mexican-American War. 1864 to 65, Navajos and Apaches are detained to Fort Sumner. It's the height of kind of architecturally the territorial period where kind of America is starting to bring in its more European approach to design and trying to imprint it on the local forms. 1880, the railroad comes. 1912, we become a state. Mexico is a state in the United States, for those of you who didn't know. So at present, we have 19 pueblos in New Mexico. They speak several languages. I myself am fortunate to be able to understand Jemez, which is a Towa language, but it is not at all similar to the other communities. And for that reason, a lot of people understand the ancestral Puebloan communities to have also multiple languages. So kind of skip to the father of architectural, the Pueblo revival style here is John Gaomin. He's a huge figure in the region, and his kind of history starts to work with the statehood history, where at first America was trying to make this region look like the rest of America, and then kind of roll that back and try to make it look more unique and to encourage tourism and industry to come to the region. John Gaomin was the fourth John Gaomin. All of his family were civil engineers. He went on to train as a civil engineer at the Virginia Military Institute, but he was born and raised in Pelotas, Brazil. So he had a different kind of formative year, training than a lot of his contemporaries. In 2019, he got the flu, right? So we're in the midst of a pandemic now. He had been working with a bank at that time, and one of the treatments was to go to a sanatorium. We get fresh air, right? You need fresh air to be able to weather the storm. Oh, actually, no, he got the flu, but he worked for a bank. Apologies. He actually had tuberculosis, which inspired the sanatorium prescriptive approach. There he met Carlos Vieira, who is a painter, and this painter just really kind of made John Gaomin just super excited about architecture in the region. he, as part of this kind of buddy history, Carlos Vieira gave John Gaomin a series of albums, photo albums. He was a photographer, and then he would take those as inspiration for some of his paintings. And so what you see are a list of the albums, you know, predominantly Pueblo communities, but also there's an interesting portion that is old Santa Fe houses, new architecture, and of course, bad architecture. So these albums exist here in New Mexico at the Center for Southwest Research at UNM. I've taken it upon myself to take photos of some of the you know, images of my community, Jemez Pueblo, and you'll see kind of how I have better images, how he laid out his pages to kind of describe, you know, the qualities of light, some unique kind of stairways, different colorations. It's a very interesting method, and I'm sure John Gaomin, who was trained in the Beaux-Arts in Denver, when he returned, that kind of training really asks you to, it's make new design with precedents. In other words, research and examples to inform your new construction. So I'm sure he referenced these quite a bit. And John Gaomin saw his work as a continuation of the work before him, and he was really continuing that legacy. So a lot of his examples of his characteristics allow for more local craftsmen and really give them the ability to ground his construction in the region. And there are quite a few local craftsmen who have been doing it for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years before him. And these are all vessels from the San Ildefonso community. And we see Russell Sanchez, Eric Fender, Maria Martinez, and it's all, you know, relatively the same material, but very different approaches and stories. And so that starts to get into a little bit more of what, you know, the mixing of mud, right? So this plaster being of the earth and this commune with your structure and the constant repair, but also constant refinement of your dwelling space, right? I guess it's so to say that there's more to a building than just the materials. It's kind of a basic understanding, but it's something that we as contemporary designers use in all of our projects, but more specifically also in our projects with tribal communities. So I'll quickly go through an example of one here is Okeowenge, which is one of the pueblos north of Santa Fe. Here we completed 35 rehabilitations, and we brought this kind of more ancient place into balance with the present, right? So we managed to get all of the overhead lines buried, which really kind of reactivates that Mother Earth, Father Sky dynamic, which is a huge part of what people are attracted to with the stucco or the earthen plaster, and a big part of what a lot of painters and artists who come here are attracted to. But you know, this community opted to return the earthen plaster to a lot of their facades, which is great, especially when it has an Adobe structure. And kind of just a quick kind of present day understanding of how a project can really support the community. We brought, you know, 43% of the work done was by Okeowenge tribal members, and returning some of the money that's spent on these projects back directly into the community. These are kind of concepts that we know now with bottom line kind of understandings, but these are things that were done for many years to redistribute wealth. Here's some renderings we've done of the region, what it may or may not look like in the future using old photographs of where 2 stories are. And so going back to kind of John Gaomin's like approach to residential architecture, adjacencies, and connections to the outdoors were very prominent in his designs. And he's working through turn of the century, early 20th century clients right here in the Santa Fe region, and using these understandings that he's seen from the tribal communities to work for his clients. So here are some examples. And then I also included an image of a contemporary Puebloan home with a large eating space. You can kind of compare it to some more historical imagery. What you start to notice is that there's a modularity that's created with the viga spacing, how much roof structure you can really support based on how tall of a tree you can get. And so I think a lot of folks who are kind of new to the region were really impressed with kind of the organizational quality that modular construction brought. It's a very basic understanding, but a very efficient one. So kind of getting back into the idea of Puebloan kind of worldview, interstitial spaces or spaces in between are also part of this duality, right? So the built part, which is these are figure ground diagrams of many pueblos, show what a male, kind of the built part is considered like more the male protrusion. It literally holds the female part, which is be like the valley or the void. And so you can't have one without the other, right? So understanding this duality was a big part of the kind of plaza and space in between for a lot of the communities. Here's kind of an example of an aerial view, Jemez, of course. And kind of getting a little bit more into the Jemez, and this is just one example because it's my community, but there are very many other examples and that inform contemporary practice, especially in Santa Fe, are window openings and having windows can't be on the same plane as the exterior. They're all recessed. They can't be kind of toward the corners because you couldn't support the load above it. Of course, we can do those things now, but these kind of just details are codified here in our city. And it's really taking homage to these designs and where the inspiration is coming from. I'm gonna have to go through some of these. I think I'm running short on time. This is a historic image of Okewenge, which I love, with the shade structures, and you can tell it's summer because all of the chimneys are capped with pottery. Another concept I wanted to kind of bring in was the idea, this is an aerial view of Coche de Pueblo, Santo Domingo, was kind of how Pueblo communities as a whole are very, very much an urban form. The density is really concentrated, and you start to see how zoning has worked through these iterations where you have kind of the more residential, the center. Of course, the church is now a part of the landscape. So kind of day houses or spaces to go have lunch when you're attending your fields, which are surrounding the community. Of course, water is very important, and then livestock, and of course your horizon. So I want to go through this quickly. This is Santo Domingo again. This is some of the work that we've done there, past, present, and what we've designed. It's multifamily housing on new construction, really close to a rail runner, which is kind of a commuter train from Santa Fe, south of Albuquerque. It's one of the few stops. We were able to create 41 units there. This is our initial sketch, kind of really paying homage to the passive solar, giving the vehicular its own space and giving the pedestrian a separate space. Really calls to the communal nature of it. And so what we did was we were able to create, with the storage requirements from HUD funding, a space that removed some of the It could be potentially toxic activities of jewelry making outside of the spaces as you're seeing in these little kind of storage units. Simple as adding a window and some power. Really, some of them are used as storage, but it was an example of how we can use these ideas in a modern way. And of course, the swales where you have water is a big part of Pueblo understandings, much like the Taos community, who has an actual stream running through it. With that kind of water source, you're able to kind of get much larger construction, and the community is able to, from 1899 through 2015, kind of largely keep a similar construction aesthetic. Of course, it's continual repair, and it's a very important part of the community there. In the same light, waffle gardens of the Zuni are featured in a lot of publications, and also kind of naturally occurring ponds. This is Acoma. Let's get into some more passive solar that we can kind of see. I think I show these images to kind of describe, what we would today call a townhome or multifamily housing. These are not what the community would have called them, right? This is just how we build, allowing for an offset for the shadow to not impede on your solar gain for your neighbors. It just seems like a very smart thing to do. And we took that kind of concept in one of our multifamily projects to allow for maximizing solar on the east-west in a lot given to us, adding some circulation, and then allowing for maximum solar gain. And this is a project we have going on here in Santa Fe. It's a 64-unit project that we're looking to make net zero. And so here's the site plan for it. It's under construction now. We're very proud of it. There's also, this is housing for artists, it's low-income housing. We also have a makerspace that could serve as a shared resource space, but could also be considered maybe the heart of the community. And I think that's a lot of kind of what I'm working towards, is trying to reincorporate, whether or not it's a material-based or a way of organizing these systems, to have these understandings inform contemporary construction. This is not Denver. This is Los Angeles. This is in the Times at the beginning of the pandemic. I say this to say because we really need a better solution for the current problems we have. 25% reduction in greenhouse gases is really kind of a goal, right? Like we need to reduce it far more. And during the first months of the pandemic, China saw these satellite images with the reduction globally down 8 to 11%, but it's not very much, right? So transportation only takes up 25%, whereas building and operations, construction materials are a much bigger part of the pie. And so I think that if we could kind of look to the past to kind of inform our future, I think we'll be in a better place. And I think just kind of, if I could speak a little bit more personally, that until we kind of get away from the idea of Native American or Indian, we're not going to start to understand or give these communities the opportunity to kind of contribute back to the land that they've held in such for so long. There's current construction happening on that same land, but to forget all of these kind of concepts. These are communities that had ways of thinking and understanding that had been refined before ideas like vernacular or even Pueblo, which is a Spanish word that defines the community, or biophilia or organic or sustainable or geothermal or net zero. All these were things that were not defined in the way that we're defining them now, but were just kind of how things were. There was food that was all organic before organic became a thing. So I think that's kind of where I like to leave it. I know that I took way more time than I needed to, but that's kind of some of the information I wanted to share today. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Garen. We'll go ahead and jump in with Dr. Porter Swentzel's portion of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Garen. That was awesome. I love all the pictures, and I think it lines up really well. My presentation is much more sort of personal in terms of education as a learning how to mix mud. And so I love all the context you provided. So it works out perfectly. And so, as I said, this presentation really has to do with more of an educational component. And so my name is Porter Swentzell. I'm from Santa Clara, Pueblo. Also, as Heidi introduced me, work at the Institute of American Indian Arts, which is located in Santa Fe. So I always want to make sure that I clarify terms before I use them sometimes, because I'm going to be using the word traditional as part of traditional architecture or traditional arts, because we do include that as a course, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But I always make sure that I define tradition very particularly, because there's lots of ways that you can use tradition. And so this is my definition that I just draw up to make sure I share. That traditions are those practices and beliefs developed by people through a long and intimate relationship with their place. So that traditions are a communal thing, and that they're developed through intimate relationship with a particular place. And this gets us away from having a accidental sort of attaching traditions to things that, perhaps are not derived from a place-based practice, perhaps. So when I use that word, I usually try to make sure that I clarify that first. Also, I have to give credit, because everything that I'm going to talk about here are not my ideas that I developed myself or anything like that. Because as Garen so perfectly pointed out, we have a very long tradition in the Southwest, in Pueblo communities, of being builders, of building our own homes and our own public spaces and our own zoning systems and everything like that. And so, and as Garen pointed out, that knowledge has passed down through many generations. So the knowledge really for me goes back to my great grandparents, are pictured here, pre chainsaw, but they're using the most advanced technology at that time, sometime probably in the 1950s. My great grandpa on the right side there built multiple homes and other structures, including later in his life, he became a Baptist missionary as part of the family story. And he ended up constructing a couple churches out of Adobe as well. And so that tradition of building homes carried on to my grandmother, who Garen mentioned and really summed up some of her sort of philosophical writings of translating this tradition into a written form and into a visual form. But Rina Swensel, who I always remember her in these kinds of ways, as somebody who was always doing stuff. And of course, there she is plastering a structure later in her life. And she definitely, besides being perhaps the first Pueblo woman architect, I'm fairly sure that she was, or first Pueblo woman to hold a degree, not to say that there weren't Pueblo women architects stretching back into the depths of time, but she got those credentials in the Western world as well. And so she built the houses that she lived in and passed that knowledge on to my mom on the lower left-hand side, who she's known as an artist, but she's also built over a dozen Adobe homes in her lifetime. And so this is all part of the tradition of building the homes that we live in and carrying on that tradition, going back, as Garen showed, at you know, Chaco Canyon and these places stretching back into time. So, but part of also my grandma was very outspoken at a time when this sort of wasn't proper to speak about, in terms of critiquing the government housing, or HUD homes, that were being constructed in Pueblo communities starting in the early 70s onward. And she coming from Santa Clara, Pueblo. Santa Clara was one of the first places, one of the early Pueblos to really adopt HUD homes and government housing. And part of the challenge was that, as Garen pointed out in his presentation, architecture represents cultural philosophy, and those wonderful pictures of how the homes that we live in represent our worldview, right? And so when you build, and this is just sort of a generic HUD home floor plan here from the 70s, when you build houses that are radically different than sort of the type of homes that you see on the right-hand side of, that's from Acoma Pueblo, of these sort of row houses, and Garen showed lots of examples of that as well, that the actual breakup of the physical space of the house represents a direct assault on the social structure, the worldviews of communities, right? And so she was speaking out directly against that imposition of colonization. But we can also see some other things that are directly related to the adoption of HUD homes. For example, when you start to look statistically at the incidence of language loss, for example, that language loss and HUD homes are paired up very nicely in chronological time in Pueblo communities specifically. I'm not talking about other communities, but for Pueblo communities specifically, the wide-scale adoption of HUD houses is directly linked with language reduction, right? And so also we think of, when other people build your homes for you, what happens to the knowledge for building homes, right? And so we also think about houses as basically like one of those most basic human inheritances, that us as human beings, we don't have the best claws, we don't have the best fangs, our fur is pretty minimal, right? Our top running speed is not that awesome compared to other creatures. We can't fly. Our vision is not as great as some other animals and birds, right? We don't operate well at nighttime, right? As part of our eyesight. And because of all the frailties that are part of who we are as human beings, that we need to build architecture in order to protect us from the elements. It's one of the most fundamental aspects of the human experience, right? And that our architecture has always been in place, right? And that the sense that our architecture is adapted to the particular environments that we have lived around the world, right? And so my grandma, and passing down to my mom and then on to me, very much took it serious that carrying on our traditional architecture was larger than just a house. It was about carrying on social structures and worldview and things like that, right? So when I was a little kid is when I first got my first building education, and that my mom at Santa Clara was given a shed, a little wooden shack really, that you can see on the left-hand side there, to live at on the Pueblo lands. And to add to that shack, she put up a old army tent. That was my first bedroom. And so one morning she went out with a stick and drew on the ground next to the shack outline of a home, right? And then started to build it as a single mother with two little kids, me and my sister there. So some of my really early memories include carrying Adobe bricks that were as big as me. They seemed like they must weigh like, 80 pounds or something, and hauling them. And so this was right away that early education of my mom building a home for us to live in using mud, right? And so very early on, one of my jobs that I took on was to mix mud. At first, mixing with your feet and your hands, and mixing in the open pit in the ways that I go back into time, but also, of course, later on using other tools like wheelbarrow and hose, things like that, more modern tools. And so all of my life, I've been mixing mud. That's my main job. In fact, throughout all the many houses that my mom built or helped to build, that was one of the key jobs and key memories, is hauling bricks and mixing mud and moving the mud around. And then my son that you can see in the background on the right-hand side, my two boys, that's kind of like their job now. They've moved into that position to mix mud, because mixing mud is at the fundamental level for any kind of the architecture, right? And of course, longer ago, there was puddled Adobe bricks or terrace or tiered Adobe piled up to build walls for Adobe walls. Of course, later on, the idea of Adobe bricks was brought by the Spanish. And so making Adobe bricks from scratch is the important part that happens next after the mixing of the mud. And so a lot of these images actually come from a class that was taught at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And I've actually seen a number of the participants join today's meeting, so they might see themselves in these. So it's wonderful to have them part of it. And then, of course, the modern way of constructing houses includes footings and foundations and all of that. But the old Pueblo style architecture, at least in the northern Rio Grande area, centered a lot on these stone sort of footings, just to separate the mud from the ground itself in a little way, right? Create sort of the layout of the house itself. And so even some of the structures in the example on the right-hand side still use stone as a foundation to the walls, right? And then, of course, hauling the bricks, right? Once they've dried and cured enough to carry them. And you can see when you're building with your family members and relatives and working all together to build your houses, right? You can see the OSHA certified footwear that's being utilized in the imagery, right? The strict age requirements for employees, right? So keep those images and thoughts in mind, right? Because then also, as you're laying the bricks, sometimes you have to break them apart to get the shape that you want. You can see a bread oven on the left-hand side where the bricks really need to be shaped correctly for it to tear in and create a dome shape. And of course, the bricks need to be interlaced so that the structure is strong, right? And then as the walls go up, we can put in windows and doors and put in the necessary infrastructure for that. And of course, you have to be patient, because it's not just going forward with your building construction sort of deadline and like, we're going to have to meet this deadline by next Friday or whatever, because you can only layer so many tiers of mud before the mud needs to dry and get strong and stable. Then you can put some more layers on there. And then maybe it's a rainy day or the monsoons are coming in the summertime. And so you can only work for a little while, and then you need to take time off from the weather and pay attention to the way that the sun moves through the landscape, right? And so, and also, as you get to the roof, and Garen pointed this out very well with the vigas, and I'm actually sitting in my house at Santa Clara, so you can see my vigas here in the main room, which is about 16 foot across, because that's the longest vigas that could work for this main room of the home, right? So putting those in, and of course, filling all the little cracks and crannies in between the roof and the in the cracks of the bricks, right? Mixing more mud, more and more mud, finding chunks of adobe, finding rocks, finding whatever materials will fit into those areas, right? My mom plastering the floor, you know, making a mud floor so that the old houses have, and a lot of the traditional homes still have the mud floors that are part of, you know, where you are still very much connected with the earth. There's nothing separating that mud floor from the earth itself, right? And, you know, when you sweep it, when you put water on it to keep the dust down, it smells like rain, like a fresh rainstorm that came, right? And it's one of the most wonderful smells to me is the smell of the wet adobe floor, right? And then, of course, the final step that, as Garen pointed out, needs to be repeated over and over again throughout a home's life cycle is the plastering, right? Again, got to mix a lot of mud for that, right? And that's my job is, you know, in a lot of, traditionally for a lot of Pueblo communities, women are key members and key knowledge holders in the architecture, not only in the building part, but especially in the plastering of the homes, right? So again, carrying on that social structure of, it's my job to mix mud. There's my mom and my grandma who's passed on, and one of my aunts plastering, carrying on the tradition of maintaining houses, right? And of course, one of the more destructive things that you can do to an adobe home is to put stucco on it, which seals off the exterior and interior and doesn't allow the walls to breathe and change shape as the seasons pass, right? And then it causes the structure of the building to come to pieces and crumble and things like that, right? So having the mud plaster and always having to re-engage with your house and enter into that, as I said, an intimate relationship with your house is really an important part of the process. It's not like you just built the house and now you're done with that. You're going to have to continue to work on it through the years. So, you know, I want to leave some time for questions and things like that, because there's a lot of you that came, and there's so much that's there to talk about in Garen's presentation. And this is much more philosophical, is to think about building your homes as almost like a revolutionary act, especially when we think of Pueblo communities, to carry on that tradition of also asserting your inherent sovereignty as communities, that you as people are building your own homes, right? And maintaining your own homes and using technologies and knowledges that stretch back into time, right? And that also we're remembering when we build our homes and our buildings and things like that, that this is part of our most basic inheritance as human beings, right? To build structures to protect us from the elements, and structures that are uniquely developed for our habitats, right? In our particular places in the world, right? And I love this picture because the same structure you have, again, multiple generations from grandmas and down to the grandkids, the little kids, all working together to build the buildings that we need to do the things we need to do as Pueblo people, as human beings that live in a high desert environment, right? And so these are kind of the philosophies that also inform one of the classes that, well, it's part of a whole slew of classes that are taught at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and perhaps could serve as a model for other institutions to think about. And the components of these are that these classes are kind of look like a science with a lab attached to it. So it includes a 3-hour credit hour lecture component, and then a lab component, which really focuses on the hands-on aspect. So a lot of these pictures came from a few years ago when me and Daryl Lucero, who's from Isleta Pueblo, and he's in this picture as well, and in the earlier picture, we team taught architecture class, which brought students from the Institute out to Santa Clara Pueblo to they didn't get to go through the entire process because the semester is at the wrong time of year, and also because of that, there's limited time for construction, but they got to really engage with the first portion of construction with Adobe brick making, mud mixing, Adobe brick, or the foundation, the stone foundation part of it, right? And so, although these students also come from all over the United States, in some cases around the world, that because the Institute is located in the midst of Pueblo country, it was really important to engage the Institute in serving a local Pueblo community by building a communal house in a Pueblo community, or assisting with that. And also to build using materials that are relevant, culturally relevant to the area that the Institute is located in, right? So this is, unique to the high deserts of the Southwest, to Pueblo country, but it's something to think about in terms of how we teach architecture, how we think about in placing our education. And one of the most incredible things to think about as well is, and most rewarding part of these classes was seeing how exciting it was for the students to do things like dig trenches. These two are digging trenches here. I've never seen more people more excited about digging ditches than in this picture, because when you re-engage people with those basic human elements like building your own homes, and you come to realize, hey, we can take dirt and mix it with water. We can mix it with our own hands. We can turn it into a home. We can build a structure that we can live in, right? It's an amazing experience, right? And it's incredibly re-empowering because in this modern day and age, we have, this is part of the impositions of colonialism, to think about how a huge, especially in the United States, a huge portion of people, whether they're indigenous or not, have been sort of separated from the experience of constructing their own dwellings, right? You contract with people to build your home. You need to get specialists to do all the parts of it, right? But it's really important, especially from my perspective, to remember that each of us, we have a tradition, especially in our Pueblo communities, of knowing how to mix mud, right? And build our homes and build structures that are not just culturally relevant, but are very much sustainable within this particular environment. And that if we re-engage with those practices and traditions, that we're also carrying on something much bigger than that. As Garen pointed out in his presentation, we're carrying on that worldview as well. So those are my quick sort of educational and Adobe house building steps, visual steps, and just a lived experience to add on to the much deeper history that Garen provided. So thank you all for allowing me to share a little bit of what we do at IAI and my life's experience as well as a non-specialist. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Porter, and thanks, Garen. That was an awesome presentation. I mean, it was great to hear about these architectures, which are so inherently connected to the earth. As a student of landscape architecture, I'm like, this is my kind of architecture here. So it was really, really impactful and such a privilege to have you both here to share your knowledge of Pueblo architectures. So we're gonna have a quick Q&A or discussion. If anyone wants to unmute, feel free. For those of you who have to go, we're gonna put the recording up on the YouTube channel. But yeah, so this is our time for discussion or Q&A. So feel free to throw stuff in the chat and I can read them out, or you can unmute.
Yeah, well, I hadn't seen any questions in the chat, but I just wanted to thank Porter for his work. I know a lot of times when I present the kind of information I had, a lot of folks are asking, how do we continue this? How do we inform our communities? How do we keep it going? And it's good to see the work that you're doing there. So thank you.
What's his name? Garrona.
We have a couple questions here. Oh, Stephen has a question.
Yeah, is that unmuted?
Feel free to unmute, Stephen.
Talk.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. My name's Laura. I'm from Jemez, Pueblo. I have a question. Hi, Porter. This is Laura Fraua. Hi, Garrett. I don't think I've ever met you, but it's good to meet you. I was curious about in our village, there's a building section, a place called Pueblo Place. And I was wondering if any of the things that you talked about as far as like the solar houses being placed to have that solar energy use. And I was wondering if you knew if that whole section was based on any of that information that you shared.
Unfortunately, that's an example of what tribes are up against. The infrastructure project was devoid of the design. So a lot of the public communities have to jump on funding that's available from a state and federal level and have a current time span to spend it. And so what you end up with is a lot of lot placement and sizing based on roadways, which is based on engineering standards. And so that specific subdivision, although works well for like a Rio Rancho or like Albuquerque, I personally don't see a lot of connections to these kind of more specific design principles. However, I know that the housing authority there is open to potential multifamily housing, in different ways to kind of, given that existing infrastructure, find ways to make it work with more culturally appropriate design. There is a compressed earth block industry there at Jemez, and finding ways to utilize that materiality, I think, is a beginning to maybe find volumes and spaces and houses and rooms that work with that idea. So I don't know if I answered your question. It's still in the works.
Yeah, I guess what's because I went to the very beginning of the meetings where the community were invited and wanted ideas from the different people, and I know that solar issue came up and that they were asked to include that in their design. And I've, from what you shared, it's like that was totally not part of it. And for me, the solar energy and whatever technologies have been invented, I'm from the old school, but I think can help people financially. The electricity, they don't have to warm their houses because it's being warmed by the sun. And I mean, all these things that you talked about, I mean, our people can save a lot of money just by using some of the things that you talked about. And I think as people who have this traditional architecture should use that for our advantage, for our people, so that they're not spending so much money on different things. But
yeah, I completely agree. And I think I wouldn't give up hope. There's definitely still room to grow. The way that financing modules work for contemporary building, it makes it more challenging to have shared walls and multi-family housing. And that's a big stumbling block for a lot of federal funding for these types of projects. And in this specific instance, I think the community is looking towards home ownership, what makes that even more problematic, with plats and legally defined ownership, which are concepts, again, that weren't a part of the traditional way of doing things. So, but yeah, I wouldn't give up hope. I think there's still room, being that it is home ownership, there is an opportunity for homeowners to pursue those types of design principles in their own homes.
Yeah, with this COVID-19 that came about, with so many families, sometimes there's 3 or 4 families living in one household. And that to me is very, I mean, with this COVID, we need to really think about those kinds of things, maybe make smaller homes or for individuals, young people that want their own place. We have to start looking at that because this COVID-19 just opened a lot of eyes for a lot of people. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciated the way that Porter, you described housing as a right and how, you know, I'm a little chilly right now. We are not, you know, able to withstand these elements on our own. And it is, you know, this pandemic does bring that, you know, issue to the forefront for a lot of communities, a lot of instances, and a lot of spaces. So I'm feeling really grateful to have, you know, a roof over my head during these times.
So on the note of cold weather, Stephen Dorland in Southern Ontario wants to ask, says it's freezing, of course, in Ontario, has to ask if the houses need to be adapted to account for colder weather.
Yeah, I think a lot of times you'll notice in like very generally a centrally located fireplace and how those are you know, work with airflow and things of that nature. You know, even the first colonial, you know, houses built in New England all had a centrally placed fireplace. So yes, there is a need to combat the cold, and oftentimes how you utilize, you know, combustion fire is you know, the number one method. A lot of net zero principles really try to minimize openings, so smaller windows, you know, doorways and that nature to really make a tight seal. Also keep your warm air in. There are a few ways to skin that cat. So yeah, we need to stay warm.
And one thing, you know, one of my other critiques, just to jump on what Garrona was talking about, is that Adobe mud has basically no R value. So the insulation, right? When you're looking at insulation, right? So in the outside of my community, right, in the Santa Fe and in the state of New Mexico, in order to pass code, right, you need to have a certain sort of level of insulation, which means that sometimes people come up with all sorts of devious ways to get R value into the walls, like putting foam board onto the Adobe or spray insulation onto the Adobe, right? But the concept of insulation is sort of misleading because Adobe might not have a high R value, technically speaking, but it's basically pure mass, right? So I'm sitting in my house, I'm going to tilt my computer a little bit. There's a wood stove, just as Garrona said, centrally located in the main room. That's our living room, kitchen, dining room, everything room, right? The room of the house. And then there's the storage rooms on the sides and bedroom, right? On the sides. So, you know, having that wood stove there, if you run that for a little while, the heat soaks into the mass. And then for days afterward, that mass is emanating heat, right? So, you know, it's misleading for, you know, to have focus purely on insulation when the mass is a powerful source of heating. Of course, when it gets cold, it also gets real cold. So you gotta have some kind of heat to soak into the mass, so.
Great. Cynthia wants to ask if you two know of any examples where HUD funding was used to build traditional Adobe homes as opposed to the standardized homes?
Yes, the project I shared real briefly, Okeowinge does receive HUD funding. There is a really delicate balance, which one of my coworkers, Sean Evans, was able to kind of dance so well. With historic preservation, all of these historic cores have that kind of caveat, being that it is a historically designated space. Federal funds, which have their own stipulations, state historic preservation office kind of stipulations, all of these have to be satisfied. And my coworker was so eloquently able to describe how it's impossible for all of them to be satisfied. And so really taking the onus of the community and getting a really strong vocal committee to be able to respond to those and state, we're going to do these, we're going to do parts of that, and we're going to do this, but have a reason for it all, meaning it all is coming from our community and taking ownership of that. Without having a THPO, a Tribal Historic Preservation Office, they really need to find ways to adapt their standards for these communities, specifically with Adobe. And then, you know, stretching the funds enough. Adobe, it's funny how it's so expensive now because of the labor it takes, but it's really difficult to actually construct an entire community out of Adobe with federal funds. We were able to do it by having second floors all be wood frame with your traditional stucco, but there are ways to do that.
Okay, and the reason I ask is just in my couple times I've done some housing projects, I tried to look at doing that, and I just couldn't figure out how to make that feasible. So it'd be really interesting to see that. And you guys have done a great, just so you guys know, some of you, I don't know many of you, but my name's Cynthia Figueroa McIntyre. I'm an architect. I'm from Laguna, Pueblo. And so I really enjoyed listening to your presentation today. Very nice.
Yes, I do know of you, and I look forward to the day we meet.
Okay, I'd love to, Garen.
Thanks for that question, Cynthia.
You bet. I also wanted to point out, someone was talking, Laura Frau was asking about solar, but you might want to check out the website, Built Solar, New Mexico. Mayam Barudin is doing some really interesting work. I know she's done some stuff with Picaris, and she's got some examples about how they've integrated community solar projects in, historic Pueblo communities. So it's pretty interesting.
Thank you. We'll be sure to check it out. And if anyone has any other resources, I'd appreciate it if you add them to the chat. It's, the more this is a place of sharing, and the more the merrier. I really appreciate this.
So Heidi had to run, but she left us with a couple questions of her own that I will pick from here. So we were wondering, at the Owenge Pueblo project, what forces made the community want to switch back to the traditional Pueblo architecture? And then likewise, what forces contributed to the loss of that architecture? If you could speak a little bit more to that.
Sure. Yeah, I think Porter was able to kind of identify the problem being HUD housing. You really stratify a community that in that way, it makes it really challenging to maintain two residences. So a lot of the community is kind of divided between more new construction, which is surrounding the community, and versus their traditional plaza space. I do not personally know or was involved in the conversations that really were at the genesis of the new work that was done there, but I do. All I can really say is that there was a lot of vacant homes, and for our community to kind of do something about that was really, I think, where it came from. And I know that today you see kids playing in the plazas. You see a lot more activity in those communities, be it traditional or just very, casual. And I think that's really the emphasis was to kind of bring that activity back to the core of the community. And I find it to be a very inspirational, successful project. And that's to say that that works for that individual community. The Pueblos, as I tried to elaborate on, speak very different languages, have very different trajectories. I don't know what the one community over is up to half the time. So it's really really diverse, and so the solutions there may not be the solutions for another community.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most significant things about the historical examples that you showed us is the sightedness of the dwellings themselves and of the settlements, which is really amazing because it brings together that whole idea of connecting with earth, with the earth. And I wanted to ask Porter, you showed an example of a traditional dwelling structure, and you juxtaposed it with the HUD housing layout. And I wanted to ask you if the usage of the storage rooms and the grinding room, if that has changed over time, and just in general, for both of you, how the usage of the dwelling spaces has changed into the modern era.
Well, I think, and the picture, unfortunately, that I showed was not a complete picture of the row house, because the original sort of plan is 3 stories high, right? So I showed just one sliver of the three stories from Acoma Pueblo. And so in general, you look at, and Garen pointed this out as well, in general, you look at the pattern even in the Four Corners region, in ancestral Pueblo communities on the Chama River, all over the place, you'll see these, especially in the 1400s row buildings, where the lower story is almost exclusively storerooms, right? Granaries, basically. And even the Spanish, when they invaded this area, noted that every Pueblo had enough food. They would say things like they had enough food for 7 years in the future, right? But even like my great grandma would say, you need to have enough food for 4 years, right? And I thought, geez, how can I get 4 years of food stashed away? But those are part of the traditions to tide you over through difficult times. And of course, interestingly, for the Spanish, the number 7 pops up to explain lots of things because of its meaningfulness to them. And of course, number 4 pops up in a non-surprising way of how long you should store food for the future, right? For that number being important for Pueblo communities, for many Pueblo communities. So, but the use of space is generally, and Garen showed some nice pictures of contemporary Pueblo homes where eating areas and open areas that can be cleared out of furniture, whether it's for feasting, for the annual traditional activities that take place throughout the year. It's really important to have that central room. And I know even, 50 years ago, and it's still the case, that room also serves as the bedroom, the dining room, the kitchen, is even part of that in the old houses. And that people, they would lay out their beds on the floor, right? Like sardines along the floor, and then roll up your bedding and put it against the wall. And you have your couches, right? And so that's the system of sort of organizing space. But Garen also had some wonderful images of other cultures, Dogon culture, their houses, their room suites, so to speak, look just like Mesa Verde room suites, right? When you look at the layout of clusters of lineages home, right? And so today that's really important. Even when we were building my house here, it was really important to have the big room that could be cleared out of furniture for all the things that could come up in a house's lifetime. as part of living in it, you know, and then the storage rooms next to it and things like that, right? So.
Yeah, just to take that another step, I think the versatility of a big space is super key and crucial to a lot of Puebloan dwellings. A lot of these rooms will be used in ways that you couldn't anticipate. One thing that we do find are the kind of requirements for bedroom sizes and you know, communal, like I guess, living room, for lack of a better term, space that is mandated by HUD. Some communities or some homeowners would say, I don't need that many bedrooms. I'd rather have a bigger open space. So we come into those kind of instances. And one of the examples I showed, the Dogon, those were mud, you know, dwellings. And there was an example too of a space that, you know, diagrammed a dancing area. And I just love that, you know, because that is important, you know, to these spaces, because feast is kind of what people quickly tie on to a Pueblo home, where you invite outsiders into your home and you have a long table. But that's, I think, kind of an example of how many people you need to be able to support within these spaces. And a typical HUD diagrammed house is not going to do it in a lot of cases. So finding clever ways to maybe bleed it into an outdoor space or just a porch that could be infilled later, I think are some strategies that could happen. But it is a challenge, I think, to kind of think about that.
Okay, I've got one more question for you guys. So, Garen, you showed in the Chaco Great House, there was a pine tree like in a courtyard in one end of it. Can you maybe briefly touch on like the significance of trees or living plant material in pueblos or other types of structures that you know of?
That's interesting. That is an artist's rendering of the Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon. It's kind of an unknown mystery. A lot of unknowns surrounding it. I don't know an answer as to why, how, or when it existed and how big it was. But that is interesting that you touch on that. You're a landscape architect, right? So there is primarily these plaza spaces are devoid of you know, plantings. There are some kind of references to how being in that space, there's not a whole lot of adornment in that, the exteriors of homes, and it's really being present in that kind of center space gives you the opportunity to kind of be actually in nature, to see and hear what's actually around you, flying above you. And the trees, I think, are more of a temporary kind of piece to that. And so therefore, because of the timelessness that you get when you're in an open space, I think that would kind of start to distract from that kind of oneness with the world surrounding you. That's kind of what I've gleaned from why that is the case, why we don't really see too many plantings. Also, you know, it is water is a challenge with these constructions, and so it's also a very precious resource. And so there are those factors to kind of weigh in as well.
And I would just jump in. I think that was based on tree ring dating of a ponderosa pine tree that was found in the plaza there. I read a recent article throwing doubt on that, so I'm not sure, so just as Garen said, that's out. One of the cool things to me about those public spaces being cleared out that Garen brought up is even in the archaeological record, you have those plaza spaces. Very often when they're excavated, they find that those areas, meticulous care was taken in making those spaces devoid of, say, anything larger than a little pebble, right? And it's something when we talk about architecture and then social practices, right? At least at my Pueblo, usually at least twice a year, the governor calls all the men up to clean the village. And used to be, it's sweeping the village, right? And so it's all my life going and picking all the little rocks out of those public spaces and relocating them. That's a tradition that goes back hundreds of years, and you can go to like Yellow Jacket in southwestern Colorado, and there's a space within that community that showed evidence of being picked clean of rocks, right? So you go back 800 years and you find that tradition of sweeping the plaza. It goes way back, and it's a time where everybody is working together. That community building is really strong, and it might be hard work to chop weeds and clean out, right? But people are visiting, they're talking to each other, catching up. There's a lot of laughing and good times, but it's important work too for the continuity of the community, so.
Yeah, I would agree. And like along those lines, if you think about it, it is the biggest room. Would you have like a tree growing in your room, and so I think that is a big part of it. It is very much a civic space, and to be mindful of that. It is interesting that a lot of modernist architects like Richard Neutra drew inspiration from the Pueblo communities in terms of their clean aesthetic and very the use of materials is apparent, right? So that's another kind of part of that movement.
So do you think we should, now that the obelisk is gone in the Santa Fe Plaza, we should take out the trees and make it a big open space again?
I'm all for the bandstand. I'm all for a party in that volume, in that space. Yeah, it's interesting that for those of you who may not be familiar with Santa Fe, there was, with the recent kind of protests, removal of the obelisk, which was a signifier of the Civil War and how this region is very much American because of its, paying homage to those soldiers. Who were the very same soldiers who marched, Apaches and Navajos thousands of miles or hundreds of miles away from their homelands. So it is a very controversial memorial, and it was recently taken down. The big question here in our city, this is the very center of where the historic part of the city lies. Pretty much the center is what to do next. And so I think that is a good question. And, I think there's a lot of potential there for kind of bringing these distinct communities together and to find a solution that works for everyone.
Well, one of the things that also, when you look at the Americanization of the plaza, it did include the first obelisk was a giant flagpole that was planted directly into the middle of the plaza. The dragoons went into the mountains and cut the biggest tree they could find and put a gigantic American flag on it. At the same time, they were building Fort Marcy over the city with artillery pieces focused on the city so they could obliterate the city. So they were planting this flagpole that then became the obelisk. And the other thing they did was to put a white picket fence and plant grass and trees, which was, in essence, it was and I say this is this is sort of a colloquial saying, so you have to forgive me, but that they were throwing a giant middle finger at New Mexico by doing that. And so although the plaza is a nice kind of park atmosphere today, you know, and you have the bandstand and live music, and you know, it's created a different space. Originally, it looked very much like a Pueblo Plaza, right, and its original appearance. And the Americans worked very hard to eliminate that element. Even when they brought in Archbishop Lamy, who hated New Mexican architecture, right? He wanted to place everything that was mud, and you know, and try to fix it and Americanize it, right? And so that's part of the legacy that's there too. But you know, that's a whole nother story, as Karen brought up. But it's important to think about how it goes from now, you know.
Hello, my name is Neil Little. I just wanted to say thank you to Porter and Garin. You guys did a great job. I did have a question on sustainability. You guys mentioned, are you guys, I saw your pictures of the the bricks being poured or formed, if you will. Are you guys working on some type of maybe machine, an extruder that you can, is of course not expensive, but can help with those labors you talked about, you know, old construction, new ways, you know, work smarter, not harder, that maybe you guys could pass this on to definitely the Pueblos, but other tribes like say the Lakotas, Rosebud, you know, we can help them maybe build some of these lower cost homes that incorporate some renewable energies to help with those bills. Are you guys working on anything like that, or could that be in the works? Thank you.
I would just say there is machinery that exists for making bricks, and the Adobe companies do utilize some of that. There's like this interesting contraption that packs semi-moist mud into a brick form, right? And I think I want to go back to something Garin said that's very important to note, is that the bricks themselves are actually not particularly expensive, roughly speaking, right? However, the labor is where the cost really comes in, because the labor itself of the mixing the mud, hauling the bricks, laying the bricks, all of that adds up. At least in my experience, would cost so much more than the actual bricks. To give you an example, my house that I'm in now is about, I don't know, 1,100 square foot, 1,200 square foot. It has about 4,500 Adobe bricks in it, right? So 4,500 bricks. If you went and bought them and counting transportation, you're talking about, let's put it a little bit higher on the $3 a brick to have them transport from a producer, right? To not make it yourself. Add that up for a house, now you're talking about maybe $14,000. You couldn't compete with a wood frame house because the cost of lumber is so much more. For material costs, lumber is much more expensive than Adobe. However, to build this house, my family, we would get together one day a week in the warm months, and we would work with like whoever was around, kids, grandma, everybody, and just mix mud and lay bricks for 3 years. So not the fastest and most efficient way to do that, but that meant that the cost was in lunch. You know, grandma would make stew, and when we got hungry, then that was the end of the day, right? Or my mom
Sure,
would
okay.
so the
there
cost
are
comes from
extruders.
labor.
So there are extruders that do press brick. So is there one that actually lays the brick? I mean, they're 3D, or they're printing houses. You know, you're speaking of taking it 3 years. Well, let's make a machine to actually lay a wall in 1 hour. You know, we can only lay half the wall because of what you said, I mean, could that work? Or,
Well, I'm going to push back again. Maybe Garen has some good dollars and cents thing, but the side I would not give up on for nothing was spending all those days with my mom and my kids and my grandma and my aunties and my uncles, mixing mud and laying bricks. And they were passing along information. One thing that was passed on to me as I was building, say, make sure whatever flowers are in bloom at that time, that you pick them and you lay them in the layers of mud that are going up. That way, if anybody is ever walking by the house, that they'll feel joy from that. And whoever is in the house, they'll feel the joy that those flowers brought as they're embedded in the layers of the house, right? You can't get a machine to go pick the flowers that are picking at this time. You can't get a machine to tell you the stories of great grandparents and how the houses were built and the proper things that you should do as a house is being built, right? So that's my little pushback. Maybe Garen has some good sort of technology sides.
Well, yeah, I think in terms of being at mud, the drying process would prohibit kind of a rapid one for one of that materiality to be built up. Secondly, I think you're starting to look at different materials, which would be a different kind of technology. So I think there is a different disconnect there in terms of how fast we can generate Adobe homes. But that's not to say that you could do the first round of subdivision, and then once that's dried, start again on the second round. If you know a good engineer, I'm sure there are different processes that could be developed, but none that I know of exist now.
and that was just my question on trying to get the tribe sustainable. We had a discussion on solar, but that was just one quick question on maybe how we could get some of these houses built for the people that maybe where there are 3 families living in one home or there is homelessness. But I understand what Porter is saying, that there is tradition in building these structures that a machine, it's ridiculous to think about a machine building your home because of what you just said. So yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Okay, if anyone else has any questions, I think it's getting late. We're gonna wrap up. We had a really, Stephen, did you need to say
Well, a
anything?
couple of things. One, I did have a question for Garen earlier, then I wanted to make a comment on a little bit. Garen, earlier you had talked about the historical work involving HUD out at Okeowinge, and I think about 8 or 10 years ago, Zuni had a similar project to restore a lot of their historical buildings. But I was wondering, and I think I already know what the answer is, but if you're looking at new construction, does HUD consider Adobe as a viable material for new construction using HUD funds?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, that if they prohibit it outright. I think, as like Porter mentioned, in regards to the bottom line, they want to know that their funds are spent most efficiently possible, and that often takes it out of the running. That's not to say that with historic preservation, you mentioned Zuni, who has more of a stone history. A lot of their construction is stone. I think those funds could be used to repair instances where there's degradation. But I don't know that if there's a hard and fast answer regarding Adobe.
Oh, okay. The other thing I wanted to say was just a comment, kind of taking off on what Porter said, and in reaction to what Nell just got through saying, and that is that at some point as human beings and as members of communities, we have to look at our, we have to take responsibility for our own housing. We've turned it over to so many other people over the years. That's become an industry, and we look at housing as an industry as opposed to something that we as a community are supposed to provide for ourselves. and as individuals. You know, I remember one time talking with my my wife's cousin, and there was a round of HUD houses coming up here at Jemez, and Laura asked him if he was going to get one. He says, "No, I'm a man. I build my own house." And that attitude is kind of what people need to take, is that we're responsible for our shelter. And industry, and the financial industry in particular, but the housing industry, and no degradation on the architects involved too, but industry has become a way of achieving housing that separates people from the process. And we really need to return back to our own process, regardless of what the materials are within our own particular landscape.
Well said. I wholeheartedly agree. This is I think I had not had the opportunity to sit with Porter for too long prior to this, and I was very thankful that he was paired with me. I think your comments were perfectly aligned with where I want to further my career and work in that direction. So thank you.
Thanks so much for that great question, Stephen, and ending on such an important note. So I think we're gonna call it here. If you guys have any more questions, I don't know, Garrona and Dr. Swentzell, if you want to put your emails in the chat, or we can take any further questions at indigenousdesigncollective@gmail.com, and we can connect you with Garrona and Dr. Swentzell. But thank you two so much. It's been such a great evening chatting with you, and getting to learn so much from both of you. Super eye-opening. And thank you all to all of you who asked those amazing questions. Okay, everyone have a great night. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Stay safe.